We're going to kick off this afternoon, though, with a bit of a walk through time. It's a look at the history of electrical and computer engineering, and who better to do this for us than Don and Brad Kane. Electrical and computer engineering is actually the family business for them. It is the family way. Don's father, Brad's grandfather, graduated with an electrical engineering degree from UD in 1932. Don came back, joined the program, and earned his degree in 1968. And then you made it the hat trick when you came through and graduated with your degree in 1995. So this is clearly a family story that is worth telling. So we hope you enjoy it. So with that said, I know that you can tell your father's story better than anyone else, and how your dad's story inspired you. So take us through it.
Well, first of all, we're really proud to be part of the heritage of the department, and we're proud to be here today as part of this celebration. My father was a doer. He could fix anything. And even as a young kid, I recognized that he could, do anything he set his mind to. He could analyze it, figure out an answer, and then make it happen. And I always wanted to do that. And as I got older, it became pretty clear to me that my path was going to be just like his, to go do electrical engineering at the University of Delaware. He grew up in the age where electricity was not the norm. It was expanding to become the norm. And so electrification of this country was occurring in the early 1900s. And when he graduated, he wanted to be part of that, and he went to work. Initially, he had to go to work as a stevedore on a dock because it was in the middle of the Depression. But he happened to be a good ball player, so he got a job playing ball for their semi-pro team and working on the docks in the day. Eventually, in 1938, he got a job with the local power company, which at the time was Delaware Power and Light Company. And for pretty much the rest of his career, he worked on expanding the electrical grid and network in this geographic area.
And then what did you end up doing?
Well, when I graduated in 1968, I had a more general education. When he was here, from the time the School of Engineering, Electrical Engineering was formed until about 1945, the main thing they did was power engineering, everything having to do with generation and power. When I came in 1963, there really wasn't any power option anymore, which is what I thought when I came in that I was going to do. I had more of a general education, but I too went to work for the power company. But my first job was in the marketing department with my engineering degree, interfacing with large customers like DuPont, Phoenix Steel, and those kinds of customers, being sure they had the right requirements, the right kinds of rate schedules so that they could be successful in their business, and doing that kind of work. Later, I moved over into the operating area, and then until my final 10 years, I was in operations. When I ended up, I left in human resources. And to a point that I think Karen made this morning, when you get an engineering degree, you can move in all kinds of different directions. So that's how I got started, and that's how I
Well, let me bring
did.
your son in, because okay, it is genetic probably. I think that probably there was some kind of a subliminal recording in the house. This is what you'll do. But actually, you told me that it was the arrival of a computer that made you think, I kind of like this.
So growing up in the 80s was when computers became, well, the very beginning of computers in the home. And so we got a computer, a Texas Instruments, which probably not a lot of people here remember those, when I was about 10 years old. And I became very fascinated with the computer and got into programming, and was thought the computer was just very cool because I could make things very easily by manipulating the software. And so when I was in high school deciding what to major in, it was sort of a decision of, do I go into computer science, do I go into engineering? And this was before the computer engineering program had started in the electrical engineering department. But of course, there was a computer engineering concentration at that point when I started. And I decided I wanted to learn both. I kind of knew a lot about software at that point, and I wanted to learn more about hardware as well, and so to have both those backgrounds. So that's kind of how I ended up in the electrical engineering department. But it was a very different kind of road. I kind of came in more from the computer engineering side.
Did you feel the spirit of those who came before you, your grandfather and your father, as you came onto this campus?
I don't know about that. But you know, one of the things I thought that was interesting is there was a small number of professors that that my dad had, as well as myself, as instructors, and I thought that was kind of neat to have that.
Now, both of you have talked about how you responded to the actual technical portion of the field, but there was a human side to what made a difference for both of you, and that was somebody who really inspired you. Who was your inspiration? Somebody that stayed with you, that helped you to see the possibilities and the probabilities?
Well, I had a lot of interaction with Dave Robinson, and Dave was the computer guru in my age. We didn't really study computers too much. We didn't have a computer other than a big mainframe. In fact, I think I took Fortran programming in my senior year, one semester, and that was plenty. So, in my senior project, I worked on something called a PDP-8, which was supposedly the first version of a mini computer. It was the size of a refrigerator.
Not so many.
But that was his project that I worked on. And so he was the guy that was off in Washington, probably working with the Department of Defense once in a while. And that interested me that he had those kinds of skills, but I really never took to the computer thing until he got into it.
Now, and for you as well, there was somebody here that inspired you.
Yes, so I started I was in the honors program, and the honors program advisor for electrical engineering was Dave Mills. And for those of you who don't know Dave Mills, he's probably one of the more famous professors from the department, and he is one of the ones that actually developed a lot of the early internet technology. And he and I are both ham radio operators. We had that in common. We love communication technology. And I had a lot of experience with computers at that point, even though I was still early in my undergrad. And he kind of took me into his lab, and I started working with him as an undergrad researcher, and eventually went to grad school here as one of his students.
So at the end of the day, Don, it's the skill that you get with the degree that can be applied in so many different ways.
Exactly. I think Karen said that this morning, that what you learn is how to solve problems, make things, and once you learn that process, you can apply it to almost anything.
I can't imagine your dinner conversations. Does anyone have a question? Somewhere we've got the bouncing ball microphone. I'm not sure where it is at the moment. There it is, but does anybody have a question for our history of the department right here? Well, I think you guys answered everything that could. What? We have one question.
So did your grandfather there, did he have a beer at the Deer Park also?
Did your dad go to the Deer Park as well? That was the question, right?
Who, me?
Your dad, his grandfather.
No. My dad had to commute from Price's Corner on a bus. And he played sports, which meant that he had to get the last bus. So he had no time for Deer Park.
No last call at the Deer Park.
I do have a Deer Park story. And it's a good one.
Don't we all?
My wife went to University of Delaware. She's an English major, and I met her at the Deer Park.
Well, there you go. That's lovely. My Deer Park story is my husband was a beer runner at the Deer Park and used to have to throw me and my fellow journalism students out on Thursday night. We're closing. Go home. Well, thank you for that fun question. We're going to reset our panel to transition from this wonderful retrospective. A question before we move on?
Sure. Could you guys comment on how the University of Delaware has changed since you've been students and are now more senior? And you know, there's been many years of evolution of the university.
Well, it's obvious that it's changed to keep up with the times, because the things I saw yesterday on the senior project wall were Greek to me for most part. And so it's obvious that it's evolved into what's necessary for the next generation of technology in this country and in the world. And that's exciting to see. I was also excited yesterday to see the emphasis on helping students who might have some entrepreneurial hopes to get started and help them guide them into that. Because research is great, and I love folks that do research, but research without it doing anything is maybe not the best answer. Research should do something at the end. And so to be able to transform that into operable things is great.
And I'm sure you would love to be coming back and experiencing some of these things.
Yeah, so I think for me, when I look, I just started on the advisory council last year for the department. And one of the biggest differences I see from when I was in school, which is, you know, roughly like 20 years ago, is there was a huge emphasis on analysis when I was in school. You know, analyzing a problem, especially all the math behind it. And then in your senior year, you did a senior project. And I like the fact that there's now more design-oriented focus in the engineering departments. The kids are sort of building stuff all through the years, doing projects at every year. And as someone who is a practicing systems software engineer, I mentor a lot of younger people in the workplace. And I think the design aspect is one of the things that is missing. They have a lot of the general technical knowledge. So that's something that's very encouraging that I see.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to them for sharing with us their family history. We're going to transition to our next panel, but let's show our appreciation. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to gaze a bit into the future. So this is, obviously you can see the progression of what we're doing as we're going to look to maybe what can be expected upcoming down the road. It's the future of technology and education. So joining three blue hens, we are joined by Mark Bendet, who is a strategy and business development manager at Lockheed Martin Advanced Technology Laboratories, Fred Kitson, the executive vice president and chief technology officer at DTS. You have responsibilities for research and development. And I understand you were with Motorola, and you are one of the people responsible for why we get really good videos. I just watched one a few minutes ago on our cell phones, and my face is really small if it's on one of those. Edward Coyle, who is the John B. Peatman Distinguished Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Georgia Tech, the founder and the director of the Vertically Integrated Projects Program. Gentlemen, welcome. And I'm going to start there because that is piquing my interest. We'll get to the definition of that in a moment, but I think one key question that has been on my mind throughout the course of the conversations today is whether or not education is able to keep up with the speed of change in the field, and can you ever expect it to?
Well, there's actually been a lot of debate within the education community about just that question. I'm sure has everybody out there heard of MOOCs, the massively online open courses. That was supposedly going to displace campuses, and everybody would all the students would just sit at home in their pajamas in their bedroom taking courses and eventually getting their degrees in the mail, I guess. So that was useful because it seemed like it was disrupting higher education, and so a lot of people started paying more attention to what universities have been doing for hundreds of years now, and what we could do to improve that. And so what you're seeing today with there's a lot of activity throughout higher education, flipped classrooms, embedding more online material in courses, making things more interactive, even AI-based TAs answering questions for large classes.
Wow.
And I also like to think the VIP program is part of that too.
Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. But I would think the private sector has to be equally nimble to keep up not only with what education is putting out, but what the populace wants, what the marketplace is demanding. So how do you stay flexible and nimble?
Well, certainly, I mean, I think, technology is a tool, first of all. So I think Bill Gates gets credit for that how do you integrate that into your systems. But timing is probably the critical thing. I think sometimes you're too early or you're too late. And engineers probably are predisposed to think things are going to happen quicker than they do. And so I think that the key thing is, what technology has the biggest impact and when it's ready for prime time. This university is quite familiar with the Apple story. And they've been somewhat masters at that. And just a simple example, then I'll move on. But if you think of like the iPod, at the time that was introduced, there was a plethora of these little devices from Creative that would play MP3. And they had,
I can't even remember what they were called, and we had one.
Yeah, there was like a Zune from Microsoft, And anyway, they were like Swiss Army knives of junk, So they had little displays that you couldn't read outside, FM radios that you couldn't tune, the ability to store FM that you couldn't tune, that you wouldn't listen to either later, off-on switches that you leave on and be in your gym bag and be dead. So Apple just said, make it simple, and the main thing is place music. So get music, play music, and make sure there's a button to turn it off. So I think that's what we've tried to struggle with is what technology creates value at a particular point in time.
The other half of that story, though, is that it wasn't just the iPod that made it successful. It was iTunes, giving it a store that could support it and provide you the information that you could download. I think without iTunes, iPod would not have been kind of.
Yeah, it's a good segue to you, but I think that's where you get. I think the other principle here is how do you introduce systems and solutions for people as opposed to technologies.
Exactly.
But some things don't make it.
Well, and some things are still trying to make it.
They could be great ideas, but they're done.
Well, or they're not done, or they're still not getting there. The example we talked about the other day was solar energy, right? And putting solar cells on all these buildings. When I was in school here in the early 80s, we said solar's just around the corner. We have the IEC here. We have all this development. Solar cells are just about practical. In the next decade, they're going to become ubiquitous. Well, here we are, 35 years later, still not ubiquitous. I was in a meeting the other day with an oil company, and they're going, even by 2040, we expect that solar will still be less than 5% of the market. Wow. So it's one of those technologies that's practical, but because the economics of it aren't there and the demand for it isn't there, it's just not coming.
Wow.
But sometimes demand comes from us. And I'm thinking of, and I mentioned this to you before, if you had told me 10 years ago I'd have a $700 computer in my purse, right, or my daughter would put it in her back pocket, I would say absolutely not. But we all have $700 computers in our hands.
Yeah, that was personally interesting for me because you might not, some of you might remember, but there's actually something called iMode in Japan. So NTT Docomo is 70% market share in Japan. So it's still is the largest mobile carrier in the world. So I was at Motorola coming up with phones that did applications. As a matter of fact, as you were talking, I just recalled that my senior vice president at the time told me to put a camera on a phone was one of the stupidest ideas he'd heard recently. So the lessons learned, they're not all stupid, but yeah, the timing again was critical. But yeah, I worked on an ad for the Razor that we did, which we sort of transitioned from showing technology that it had video to what would you use it for. And maybe if I can do words to it, the demo would be very impressive, but we wanted to show that imaging was important. So we did this little commercial, which basically shows this guy going to a store, and it's women's shoes. And he starts trying on women's shoes. And so you don't know what's going on, and then he's like this, he's taking pictures of these shoes. It doesn't make any sense. But anyhow, he was texting those to his pregnant wife, who was taking the camera and then visualizing what those shoes would look like. So anyway, we did at that time then try to figure out a little better job of what sort of new applications this technology would enable, and then things took off.
Well, a lot of what makes these things happen is breaking down silos and making sure that education changes. So tell me about the Vertical Integrated Projects program.
Oh, thanks. So it's VIP for short, Vertically Integrated Projects. And the whole point is to make it possible for everybody on campus to actually participate in innovation. And there were a couple of key things that we had to change in terms of fragmentation due to the university standard way the university does things. All of our missions are broken up into research, education, and service as faculty. education was primarily something we did to undergraduates. You know, they sat in our lectures and we lectured at them. And then finally, there are the silos for all the different disciplines. And the first thing we did was figure out how to break down the fragmentation by time for undergrads, where everything is chunked into semesters and academic years and things like that. So the first thing we did was create these large-scale, vertically integrated teams that could have freshmen through seniors on each team. And then each student could actually participate in the team for the entire time they're an undergrad, earning credit and being graded each semester. And then the teams can roll on forever. As some students graduate, everybody else moves up, and you add new students, and the new students are trained by the returning students. Now, anybody who works for a company will recognize this model, because it's the model that every company uses. But we basically found a way to introduce it into academia. And the teams are actually very productive. And if you embed them in faculty research, then the faculty can benefit from them too. And then the students get exposed to the innovative ideas that the faculty are working on and can contribute to them.
So do you have an anecdote about one experience perhaps with this within the student population?
An anecdote? You mean in terms of? Something
that really, you know, someone who was a freshman and maybe emerged into a huge leader by junior year, or?
Well, okay, so I guess this is more of a general anecdote. One of the things we learned was to you know, not take the usual sort of honors program or this is an elite program approach to this. So when students apply to join a specific team, so we lay out the set of teams, each one led by, you know, a faculty member or two, and the students can choose which one they'd like to join. So they're picking one because they're enthusiastic about it. And so the last thing you want to do is start screening them by either GPA or by interviewing them, because we found that neither of those are actually correlated with their performance on the team. So that's the most important thing that we learned. And I think it's really benefited the students too. Because for example, VIP is considered sort of a high-end experience for students like honors programs and living learning communities. And unlike those other high-impact experiences, underrepresented minorities and women participate in the VIP program at the same rate that they appear in the background student population.
Well, there you go. It sounds, I mean, I think you're probably both thinking this would work because they'll come into the workplace ready to go, ready to be, you know, integrated into how you do your work.
Yeah, one of the best examples I can think of, sort of an academic version of this, was USC has the Game Pipe program run by Michael Zaida. But basically they're making computer games, typically. But they put together an integrated team on the order of 35 students. And so it's kind of nice because USC, of course, is a big cinema school. Matter of fact, they make more linear feed or time of video than Hollywood does. So obviously they're established there. They're less cinema arts and that sort of thing. But they have strong engineering, lean, if you know, signal processing, the digital signal processing, they're big on. Anyway, they put together, so they have storytellers, they have cinema people, they have user interface people, plus computer science and engineering. But the last one I went to, they have them every 6 months, about 35 students, but 6 of the 8 teams were offered to be funded for full companies.
Wow.
So talk about integrated. They're integrated up and running to the point that people like Electronic Arts and things will fund them to complete the game, and then they will merchandise it. So somebody that comes from a program like that is pretty much ready to go. They can go running because they've worked with a broad number of disciplines, and they know it's about a system. It's not about technology.
And I guess that would work not just in the commercial side, but perhaps also in some of the non-commercial applications.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have the same type of thing where perhaps coming out of schools, they come in with some of the most innovative ideas, some of the most creative people in our groups by far are the ones that are just coming in. But there's a lot of, I don't want to call it overhead, but there's a lot of process and procedure and things you have to do, particularly in classified environments, that clearly none of them will know coming in. So you kind of have to merge the team that knows that side of the business with all the new ideas coming in from academia and the new hires. And if you bring them together in the right way, you can do some really interesting.
A new recipe.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
All right, so, and one of the things that was in that recipe is we're not limiting by GPA. And I'm sure you were both asked what your GPA was when you were going for that first job. But when was the last time somebody asked you what your GPA was?
Never.
about the same time.
And, right, and they didn't say before we develop video for cell phones, I need to know, did you have a 4.0?
Are we talking 3.9 here?
Oh, well, you had to get it in there, huh? But that's important to know, right? Because while that is of a value while you're within the academic program to achieve to your highest level, how you're able to apply your knowledge once you're in the field is what matters.
Yeah, and in fact, we often look at the non-academic side of things and say, what did these people do because they were interested in it that had nothing to do with them getting a grade? What are the things they do in their free time? What are the things?
Drones on the green?
Well, as a good example.
Actually, I have a good example, I think. So I was recruiting at MIT, and we hired like, say, 20 people every year from there. And so we had like this draft day. We'd go in there, and I got my list, and someone had a list. At any rate, I drafted Susie Wee #1 for my team. And they're like, her GPA is not the highest. You know what? I don't know. I think I'm going with this one. Well, the reason was because she was captain of the hockey team. And it's her leadership. If you can get a hockey team and be the captain, I think that says something in my book. So sure enough, when I left HP, Motorola recruited me, she led one of my labs because she had great leadership. So the impact was much higher. Everyone had table stakes. They're all smart kids. So I think that's very important.
So I think the key is giving them an opportunity to learn their professional skills as well as the technical skills. And for that, they need an environment that is similar to, say, what they would encounter in the workplace after they graduate. And usually being on a large team, working on a large project, a sophisticated system, is where they can pick that up. And then again, if they have the time, because they're part of a team for several years, they can learn the management and project management and leadership skills to help the team succeed.
Well, let's talk about those skills beyond the technical, because that really is something everyone is talking about, soft skills, making sure everybody graduating from the university has their soft skills.
Oh, first, don't call them soft anymore.
Oh, really?
I call them professional skills.
Ah, okay.
Because soft is somehow not as important as hard skills. It used to be soft and hard. Hard was technical, soft was professional.
So they're now professional skills.
Professional.
I stand corrected for this point forward, and it's a very good point. So how do you, though, when you have an education program that requires so much of the technical, the professional skills can be overlooked? So where is the shift to make this a priority? Should it be something that starts at the high school level, or at the college level, or at the senior of college level?
That's a good question. I think you could try different things at different levels. I mean, certainly there are opportunities for students to get involved in big activities even at the high school level before they really have to make a career choice. Play marching band, things like that, playing on a sports team. There are all sorts of different ways you can develop teamwork and leadership skills. I think at the college level, it's probably, once they've made a choice as to what they're interested in terms of a career, then you'd like to have something that helps them develop the professional skills for that career.
Well, in fact, one of the best things in the electrical engineering department when I was here years ago for us introverted engineers is we had to stand up and give presentations on our research at least once a semester. So it forced us to get up in front of people and learn how to communicate in a clear and concise manner.
I was talking at lunch to someone that I guess the principle that I subscribe to, it's necessary but not sufficient to be right, to be technically right. And you don't make any impact unless you have the ability to articulate in a compelling way somebody else, your ideas. And so I think it starts like in elementary school. I mean, your ability to describe things in a priority way, succinct way, and compelling way to get your ideas sort of funded or get your eyes sold. Companies like Google, for example, probably people have worked there, but it's a very sort of socialist, very type environment, and you have to nucleate. You have to come up with your idea, and so in order to be a leader, you need someone to follow you, right? By definition. So they allow people to go out and sort of promote their own ideas, and those that promote the best will get funding. So it's a very key skill.
Well, was there a time, though, for you in your career where standing up and presenting that idea, and I think people might be able to relate to whether or not that was harder for you than doing the technical? Was that a...
Oh, absolutely.
Take me through that first experience. Let me know what it was like. Even if it was with a sweat rag, that's okay.
Well, yes, the internal presentations were one thing. You kind of know the audience and whatnot. I remember my first technical talk in a real technical meeting, And it was such a horrifically scary thing for me. I almost have blacked out relative to what happened during that thing. I just remember these, yeah, that's right. I made it through. That's about all I can say. But I just remember the sweat pouring off me from a 20-minute talk or whatever that was at the time. You know, no matter how well prepared you are, that first few times you get up in front of an audience, particularly a not terribly friendly one potentially, of people who want to say, it may not be quite true. And I remember years later, one year I gave, I think it was 72 venture talks over the course of about an 18-month period. Wow. And I did some investment banking meetings and things like that. And by that point, it was so easy for me then to get up in front of an audience and talk. And I could switch from technical speak to finance speak to, you know, sociology speak on demand, depending on who the audience was. That's and so it showed it just took some time to develop.
So for students, is that something that they grasp that is an essential skill so that perhaps they're not having that first horror experience trying to sell their idea?
Well, I think our goal is to make sure they have those experiences and know how to deal with the nervousness that comes up when you're presenting to a new audience or you're up on stage for the first time. And practice, with enough practice, you get used to it. And then once you're used to it, you can start thinking about the things that make a good presentation. Like, who is your audience? And what are they coming in with in terms of background and experience, and how do you reach them? And we work on all those things. One of the most effective things that you can do, by the way, is you have your students rehearse for your team, especially if you're going to have somebody who's funding your team visiting, and you videotape them. And then you ask them to watch themselves. They can do it in private, but they watch themselves.
And
I'll give you another aspect to that. Have them watch themselves without audio, and then have them only listen to themselves. Mm-hmm. And you pick up so much more watching. This is something that people who are in television learn to do. You can see a physical tick or something that you're doing physically that you would not notice if you were also listening. And the same is true with the voice. You can hear if you're clearly articulating your ideas when you're not worrying about what the rest of the body is doing.
Rocking back and forth. Yes,
yes. So if they do that, they'll be golden. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, though.
No, I was going to say, that's actually, even in business, we at Lockheed have a training program for those of us that interface to the media, and that's exactly what they do. They videotape us, and then they show you back. Here's what you did, and yes, you're rocking back and forth, or you're twiddling your thumbs, or you're doing whatever.
Banging the table.
Right, exactly.
So the poster session that we saw yesterday afternoon for all the projects, that's a great experience for the students. And so as we go around, you can kind of mentor them too. It's like, oh, wait a second, you didn't introduce yourselves first and say who you are. So it's an ongoing process, but they get better and better at it. And
actually, Mark made a good point. I think additionally, I think what you were saying too is the impedance matching you're able to do with different audiences. So it's not just a audience. It's if you talk to an executive audience, are you talking to a financial-oriented office? Is it a venture capital group? So I think that's an additional skill.
That brings me to a question for you. One of the important things is, and this is not to put the smaller ideas to shame, but at some point you have to know how to follow the money to be able to get something off the ground. How do you prepare for that process of understanding that you may have a great idea, but if you don't have financial backing, it's dead in the water?
Yeah, that exacerbates. I mean, if you're in university, it gets one thing, but I've been at Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, which a billion-dollar business is not always that interesting. So if you're making 120 billion, a million doesn't sound too compelling, and a billion isn't even that compelling. Like less than 1% of revenue next year. You have to grow at 5%. You need to grow. What's a $5 billion idea? Well, some of those fail. Iridium, that one didn't take off, for example. But
well, it did, but but it didn't take off commercially.
Yeah, it works well for cruise ships and things. But so I think it's again, if there's a compelling value proposition that you can relate to people and they understand, they will have faith in your idea. So it's what are those intrinsic sort of things of humans? Humans want things that are simpler, faster, and so like the cell phone. Going back to that. If you look at how the value that people put on communicating with people, keeping up with their friends, and connecting, and then you have a device that you say, hey, this device can connect everybody in the planet to everyone else on the planet. Just, think about that concept for a second. There's more than 7 billion phones, and there's 7 billion people on the planet. So an idea that was so powerful that the ability for you to talk to anybody on the planet is very compelling. So those are sustainable ideas that I think a lot of people can relate to, and it kind of takes that kind of gravity.
And sometimes it's a surprise, right? Because when car phones first came out, everybody thought that would be for the wealthy, in the back of the limo, in the town car. And the people that were really getting them were the contract workers, were the people who were on the road all day. My husband, who's in landscaping, he needed to connect to people, didn't have an office. His cell phone was his business. And he was one of the first people out there with one.
Yeah, a good example. Yeah, so that sort of goes the other way a couple times, you know, where people don't, they look at the initial value proposition was for a different audience. So since we're not too far from New Jersey, and most people know what a radio is, Marconi was standing before his board at RCA, and he was pitching the idea of radio. And again, the board came back and said, this is a terrible idea. Who would pay for a message sent to no one in particular? That makes no sense, you know. So again, there has to be an ability to present that in a more compelling way. My company does HD radio, for example, so we're always arguing, why do you even need a radio? Everything's going to be streamed. But yeah, you have to come up with, that's part of the challenge, is not only have good ideas, but how they solve real problems that people care about.
That's one of the things that I know the entrepreneurship efforts here at the university are getting much larger. And I think that's one of the things that will actually help engineers more than anything else, is they need to think about what is the value proposition for this? Why should somebody care about what I'm doing? Not just, this is faster than everything else. Yeah, but so what? You know, but actually say, no, this is why it's a business. This is why people will get excited by it.
We're talking about things that are successful. What do people learn from the failures? What do they take away from that which does not make it?
From that which does not make it. You're talking in an education context or
We're going to start with you on education, and we'll get to these guys in a minute. I'll give them a minute to think about it, because they might have more to lose by fessing up.
Take your time, Ed. Yeah.
Okay, well, all right, I can think of an example. Talk about the evolution of the VIP program, because we learned some things the hard way as we were building it, but we persisted through that and learned and adjusted the program. For instance, the first version was called Engineering Projects and Community Service. And it had the vertically integrated teams, but they were developing systems and products for nonprofits in the local community. And faculty were advising the teams. And the weak spot in that was that the faculty were not getting any benefit from advising the teams. They weren't getting teaching credit, and it wasn't building their research portfolio, which is what you need to get promoted and get pay increases. So after about 6 years of having trouble scrounging up enough advisors, we then took those teams and embedded them in faculty research efforts. And that's when that really took off. But then that version of it was not scalable, so the version of VIP that's out there right now is one that was designed to be scalable and to work in every discipline. So yes, you're definitely going to experience failures, and you have to have a good evaluation process in place to understand why it occurred and to see if it can be fixed.
All right, you're up. What's your failure?
Well, one personally that I think also, I'm going to the Apple, since I know that's a big thing on the campus here too, was 1999. If you want to go back and look in the San Francisco Examiner, Fred here is holding up this thing called the ViewPad. And I'm saying, you know, this thing's great. It can do video, you can play games, I can do imaging, it's wireless. Who would not want one of these things? Now, working for Hewlett-Packard, which is the largest computer company in the world, way bigger than Apple at the time, for example, so there wasn't like there was a shortage of money. But it went nowhere. Another bad idea Fred had, you know? I mean, why does he keep coming up with these bad ideas? So, you know, if you look at then, obviously, it looked a lot like an iPad. So you go back, you go like 5, 6, about 7 years later, Apple introduces iPad. Changes the industry. You know, almost obsolete notebooks. The new iPad Pro's got this little fold-out keypad. So, you know, what went wrong there? So I tried to answer that question, and this will be a little bit redundant because I think I failed in presenting it in compelling ways. So again, similar, you know, different product, same example is we talked about MPEG-4 video, or we talked about 1,000 by 1,000 resolution, or we talked about, you know, how many, what kind of battery was in it. Nobody sort of cares about that. They do care how Apple presented it is it's very thin, it's very portable, It's basically one big display. You can show these pictures of someone. You can watch a movie together. And so again, this is something that I sort of make a big deal of because it seems to be recurring in my career of where we missed was not the right technology was correct. You could debate the timing a little bit, but I think we didn't present it in compelling ways.
All right, you have a failure for us?
Oh, I have a massive failure, actually. I have the dubious distinction of one of the companies I worked for. I started up literally at the kitchen table, took it from zero to $150 million back to zero again. So that's one of those companies.
First part was good.
Yeah, that's right. And I still remember the day I got all the employees in the cafeteria and said, well, I have some bad news.
You didn't say have good news and bad news?
No, it was pretty much I have some bad news. But, you know, that was obviously a massive failure from perspective. But, you know, several takeaways. One, nobody died, right?
Very good.
Secondly, almost everyone that came to that company and worked as part of that team went back to various other organizations and were promoted relative to their old positions because they had learned so much, they had become so much better at what they'd done. They had been part of a high-performance team. We had actually put together, probably still to this day, the team I consider the best team I ever worked with. Oh, wow. And so I still try to capture those traits in the companies and organizations I work with now. And I look back and say, well, here's the things we did right, here's the things we did wrong, here's how we can do it better next time. So, you know, and that was probably as big a failure as someone could probably do. But, you know, hey, like I said, we learned a lot. It was a 5-year, really fun ride. I probably could do it better next time. But
you kind of, you know, your voice changed a little on the word fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was interesting.
It was interesting in the Chinese sense, right?
So let's look to the future, because we're going to put it out to questions in a few moments. So get your questions ready, and we'll toss the magic ball your way, or magic square. So now that we've talked about what didn't work and what has worked, forecast for me. And I know that we're not going to hold you to this. Nobody's going
Just a little bit.
to call you up and, you know, say you said this in 2017 in May. What are we going to see in 25 years? You know, let's just, I mean, not flying cars, I don't think.
No, definitely not flying cars. I mean, it will still, part of it will still be assimilating and processing information. I mean, the amount of information we're exposed to now with all the connectivity and whatnot, the limit is now our ability to understand it and get it into the appropriate form. So intelligent agents, a lot of more artificial intelligence, that type of thing, will definitely be coming down the pike. As well as, in 25 years, we're going to have about another 2 billion people on the planet. So resources like food, energy, water, et cetera, will be driving some of the focus of where technology is being developed. So.
It sounds like you're writing a sci-fi script. Yeah. Take us 25 years away.
Well, certainly things take a little longer to think. So if you look at today, the hot items are certainly augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, and the applications are just coming out. You know, you can walk down an airport and it translates Japanese and things like that. So that one, by that time, would be, I think, fully baked and fully operational and seamless. Certainly, the Internet of Things is very fashionable today, and it's basically integrating all kinds of sensors, all kinds of data. So certainly, you'll be able to fly over and collect data on crops, you know, because you've got a couple billion more people. Dams will give you information if they're about ready to break. You know, roads will tell you their status. And actually, one of the patents I did a long time ago was called Hee Haw, Hey, Everything Has a Web Address. And that one came true. So at that time, we were just trying to do laser jets. So that was a big thing 20 years ago, to have a web address. Everything will have a web address. So, you know, the Nest phenomena of your thermostat, your camera, things like that. Autonomous vehicles, I was at the NAB for the person that's in charge of that for the United States, and there's some, they've sort of cleared all the litigation type problems, but you can see early starts there. They estimate about 50% of automobiles 25 years from now completely autonomous. Even my Subaru Outback today has eyesight, and it can track the car in front of it and track lanes. So certainly that would be fully matured, which would change things like driving. So I think it is, as you point out, the underlying technologies have always been computing and communications. I think they estimate in that time frame on an individual day, mobile devices is on the order of 788 exabytes, so I think that's 10 to the 18th or something, you know, a couple thousand, you know, you got 100,000 gigabytes. So that would be going in a day. So the connectivity from mobile devices and all these Internet of Things will just be phenomenal. So the computing infrastructure will actually be there. And yeah, and as I said, the visual supporting technology and communications, but the computing would be on the order, again, of, I think they sort of estimate $1,000, again, would buy you on the order of exabytes per second of computing. So it just continues in those directions.
So you mentioned that there was a time we thought kids would be getting their college education in their pajamas and getting their diploma by mail, and that didn't come out. So I won't hold you to your prediction for where you think we're heading in 25 years, but paint that picture for me.
Well, first of all, they took most of the good stuff. So,
you got last, sorry.
yeah, so I'll say what they said plus some more. So the Internet of Things, I agree, is really interesting, although I would really like to modify the name. It's really the Internet of People and Things. When I first heard somebody talk about the Internet of Things, the example they gave was your toaster could talk to your refrigerator. Well, I don't care if my toaster talks to my refrigerator, but I care if they tell me something useful. And so there's always some sort of human-driven need that has to be behind all of that technology. And seeing what that is not necessarily something for us to do. It's actually the students who are sitting here today. Because one of the more interesting projects we have in VIP was actually taking a look at a football game day and in a stadium. Because this actually has everything. Okay, it's got 50 to 100,000 people, depending on your alma mater. They all have cell phones now with cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and who knows what next. They've all got 5, 6 sensors on them. The stadium has all sorts of infrastructure that has sensing and other things built into it, along with all the media companies. And so if you do the calculations just for something like that, you want to give a megabit per second to each of 100,000 people. Pretty soon you're up to needing a terabit per second connectivity into the stadium. So 4G, 5G doesn't cut it. We really need infinite G. 5G is 5th generation cellular. We're currently at 4G right now. And I think one of the reasons it's hard to predict, if you kind of look back the last 10, 20 years, who would have predicted Google, even a year before Google occurred? I mean, there were some search engines out there, but nothing that really took over like Google did. So I think it's getting a little harder to predict what the future is going to be because of things like that. It's not clear what's going to scale, but in terms of applications, but the technology keeps scaling. It keeps getting faster, memory's cheaper, processing is cheaper, and it's ubiquitous now. It's in every device you hold. Mm-hmm. So I think the only thing that you can really predict reliably is it's going to be very rapid change. And the real question is, to what degree can people keep up with that? Because people are changing slower than technology's changing. And society is certainly changing slower than technology's changing.
All right, let's see what they have for you, okay?
Sure.
Who has a question for us for the bouncing square? Especially from maybe one of the students here too, but let's go over here first. Get ready to catch.
Carol.
And then if one of the students would come up with something, I think that would be terrific to hear from you.
I just wanted to play with this. I've been watching it for the last couple of days.
It has a value proposition.
Yes.
So how is our health going to be affected by these technology changes? They say that the internet and the access to information has made us all ADD, attention deficit disordered, and how are we working with healthcare professionals to make sure that the technology as we go forward is not killing us?
Maybe I'll jump into that one, Carol. Actually, I worked in bioengineering a little bit too, and just a couple areas that come to mind for me. One is certainly in certainly cardiac care and what's going there. And I was just in the hospital observing someone else, fortunately. But the fact is, even today, you might not everyone familiar with it, but the size of about a 2032 lithium battery can power for 10 years a pacemaker now. And it can be implanted without any surgery to the heart. It can go through a vein and be installed while the patient is awake in about 20 minutes. I think that's pretty cool. But then you get into the Internet of People, if I might borrow that, because what's very cool now is if there is some arrhythmia, that can be transmitted to your home unit, which then transmits to your doctor. So your doctor notifies, as you're walking around every day. And finally, this is today, but finally, if you do have a defibrillation event, you know, we have one, I saw one when I was walking around campus because I worked in those AEDs. It's built in. How nice. You fall over on the treadmill, bam. So anyway, so you fast forward 25 years, you can already see then the automation and the data collecting. So now you'd have every heartbeat of your heart going forward. By the way, the storage on a cell phone is approaching the point where you could store not only every word that's ever been spoken, but all the words that have been spoken. You could actually collect, it's about 5 exabytes of everything that anybody in the planet for over the last, however, thousands of years has ever been spoken can be stored. So this kind of data, would be ubiquitous. And just the other thing is just on the, we have done work with CMU, for example, and as you get older, you tend to forget things. But basically, you have video camera. The whole house is basically instrumented. We can watch every habit you do, get all the physiology of you. But it would help you, like it would actually record you while, say, you're making your favorite apple pie, and you forget, put cinnamon in it. Hey, Carol, don't you remember the cinnamon? So we have a couple homes set up like that, and they're a little obnoxious right now. But I think you could see, though, that this collection of data, ubiquitous data through your whole life, is going to help you, medically, training, and giving you all that good feedback.
The extension to that as well is they're now trying to collect all the health data from the entire population and say, when we see these trends in these people, this leads to a heart attack, or this leads to a stroke, or this. And while I'm not wild about the invasiveness of all of that, and I don't necessarily want an intelligent agent making a decision for me that says, you really should drive to the hospital about now, or whatever, that is something that is definitely coming along sooner rather than later. The other thing in technology right now is synthetic biology, where we can create molecules, we can create organisms that nature has never created previously, and those can be used for very specific treatments for very specific ailments, almost on an individual basis.
Do you feel better?
I do, especially since my son is actually needing a pacemaker replacement surgery this year, so
oh, wow.
I'm very excited to hear the
No,
technology.
it's really cool. And then finally, just to leverage off one thing Mark said, one of the most amazing things, if you haven't read about, is regeneration of actual limbs. So certainly, we have. I saw someone downtown Newark, had a limb severed. So they can actually, with electrical stimulus, a sort of project you could have here, you can actually get legs to grow on, frogs and things in any place on their body. So the state of the art in that area is just phenomenal too.
Do we have another question?
I'm ready to throw.
She's dying to throw it. Go for it.
Terrible at this.
Good one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for our engineers in the future?
Let's start down there. Go ahead. I saw the big breath. I saw it.
I felt it. I think.
Yeah.
Well, actually, one of the things that I think is interesting about engineering is that sort of the scope of what we're expected to consider as we do our jobs has grown over the years. And I include more than just engineering in this. This is all STEM fields, because what we do in our labs very quickly turns into companies, which turns into products which permeate society. And you have to think more and more about the consequences of those, and what society is going to have to live with if we don't get things quite right. So computer security. That's an example of something that's going to haunt us for a very, very, very long time, and may impede things like some of the, if we live in if all of our physical data of our health is up in the cloud, well, maybe somebody else can get up into the cloud and see what we're like and cause us problems. So I think being able to produce STEM graduates who can actually think about the consequences of what they're doing while they're doing it, and as much as possible. It's impossible to exactly predict the future, but we have to do our best job at it.
And from your end of the universe, what's the biggest challenges?
Well, actually, I think the biggest challenge is also the biggest potential benefit, which is to continue in this industry. And I can say this, I've been almost 40 years now. you have to keep learning. There's always new stuff. If you think about what was going on when I was back in grad school, I've certainly had to learn a tremendous amount of new information from that time till now. And fortunately, I enjoy learning. I hope you do too, but you're going to have to keep doing it through your entire career. So.
We have time for one more question. That's a short throw, okay.
I remember when I think one of you mentioned you had to pick a team from, I think, some student from MIT. You picked a student that she was the captain in a hockey team, irrespective of her CGPA, something like that.
Right.
So I just want to know, is that something that is, that choice, it's something that is particular to you, or is that a trend you're seeing in industry that maybe recruiters, they pay more emphasis on your leadership skills than just your academic abilities?
Yeah, I would say it's, there's probably one aspect is that I know more application processes for jobs and even for graduate school tend to look for those special things like that make you interesting. Whether you know different languages, you have different life experiences, and I think that is becoming more valued. In this case, additional kind of little tidbit was not only did I have to recruit Susie, I had to recruit Susie's mom. Because she wanted to know that there was great opportunity for her daughter at HP. And this is probably not on your question, but she ended up doing a national commercial for Hewlett-Packard. So I remember phoning up later and saying, hey, how about that? Was that good? But no, I think it depends. I think when you're interviewing, it's probably, point these things out. And I think enlightened people realizes these are the leaders. I think another quote it doesn't matter, sir, it's a British person. But he basically said that, it's really about, there will always be new technology. The question is, are there going to be new ideas? And that's what you bring to the table. I think if you can, tell people how your experiences bring new ideas, and I think that's the value proposition. Just finally on the last question, I think one additional thing is I think the challenge is going to be, not only do you have to go broad, you also have to go deep. You have to know a few things, and most of the solutions today are not point technologies. There's going to be integrations of technologies. So I'd say the other thing you should look at is systems technology.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I'm a little nervous about the medical data, but it'll be, and I don't like the idea of a car. I want to drive my own car, but that's okay.
Well, but when we all have pre-existing conditions, then we're all safe, right?
There you go.
There you go. Thank you very much. I want all of you to sit tight. Let's thank them, though, before we move on for their time and energy today.
I guess we go.
I guess we go.